Thank you very much to Jan Morens, first and foremost, for being the driving force of the conference in Jerusalem, actually. Thank you very much for introducing me. Thank you all for coming. I would like to thank Vivian Liska, who is not here, but who is here anyway somehow, but now in Jerusalem, for inviting me, for letting me be the representative of this incredible conference that we had in Jerusalem. And it is my pleasure and my honor to bring a little bit of Jerusalem to you here today. As you can see, unfortunately it's not very clear in the view, but you can see this is Jerusalem, right? This is a map of 1969. And what I would like to do with you today is to take the same walk that Celan walked when he visited Jerusalem in 1969. So in 1969, in October 1969, Celan visited for the first and only time Jerusalem, Israel, but especially Jerusalem. He was there from the 30th of September 1969 until the 17th of October. And most of the time he spent in Jerusalem. He read on the 9th of October in Jerusalem in front of an audience of poets and literary scholars, university members, and it was one of his most well-known readings. And I would like to walk this walk that he did on the same day. Before reading in the evening at Beit Akron in Jerusalem, he would take a walk. He took a walk together with a close friend from his youth, Ilana Shmueli, who had emigrated to Palestine after the war. And together they walked from Mount Scopus until the Old City. And this is a walk that we also took physically. So the question that was very present to me when I worked on the poems that Celan wrote after he came back from Jerusalem. He wrote a big cycle of poems on Jerusalem that are now called the Jerusalem poems. There is actually also one on Tel Aviv, but clearly Jerusalem left a much stronger impact on him. So my question was, what do we do with these poems that refer so clearly to specific geographical spaces in the city, who refer very clearly to places, to monuments, to parts especially of the old city? Is it possible to walk this walk again? Or are we going in an impossible direction? Are we doing an impossible thing? Is it possible still to walk with these poems through the city and experience something of what lies at the source of these poems? So to begin, I would like to ask you, who has been in Jerusalem, who knows Jerusalem a little bit? Okay, so...
In 68.
In 68?
69.
Okay.
I didn't know. I was here.
Okay, so you know how much the city has changed also since then. So this is the question, right? We are now celebrating 50 years from his visit to Israel. Israel has changed immensely, as any country has, but Israel in particular. 69 was, of course, a particular time to be in Israel, a bit more than 2 years after the Six-Day War. So actually what Celan could do was to access for the first time a part of the city that was inaccessible until two years earlier. So Mount Scopus, for example, where our walk will begin in a moment, had been made accessible just 2 years earlier, as did the other parts of what is now East Jerusalem. So he was there in a specific time, and we on his footsteps are going there also in a specific time. I would like before to take a step back, and here you see that the idea of walking and of moving in space and of taking steps on impossible or possible roads will accompany us throughout the evening. I would like to take a step back and go back to a poem that Celan wrote, that those of you who maybe have familiarity with Celan will know. The poem is Engführung, and I will play it now for you in the reading that Celan did himself on October 9th in Jerusalem. So he read this poem. This is only the first stanza. It's a very long poem that closes the collection that is called Sprachgitter, which was published in 1959. So you see here he is doing something of presenting a poem that has a certain specific background, himself 10 years after he first published it. And I'll play it for you and I'll comment on it in a second. Yeah. It's okay.
Entführung. Verbracht ins Gelände mit der untrüglichen Spur, Gras auseinandergeschrieben, die Steine weiß mit den Schatten der Halme, lies nicht mehr, schau nicht mehr, geh, deine Stunde hat keine Schwestern, du bist zu Hause.
So this is the beginning of the poem. Could you follow the English translation? Shall I read it? If I can read it out loud? Of course.
Entführung. Verbracht ins Gelände mit der untrüglichen Spur, Gras auseinandergeschrieben, die Steine weiß mit den Schatten der Halme, lies nicht mehr, schau nicht mehr, geh, deine Stunde hat keine Schwestern, du bist zu Hause.
So, as I said, this poem was published in 1959. Usually in scholarship it is said to refer to a very famous film by Alain René, Nuit et Brouillard, Night and Fog, which is maybe the first and the most famous documentary on Auschwitz and Majdanek, for which Celan translated the French text. So when here it is referring to a terrain with infallible trace, it is usually considered to refer to the traces of the train rails that led to Auschwitz. Now, you can imagine what a movement and what we call in German Verschiebung, what a difference it makes to read these lines in Jerusalem. Right? Especially if you consider the last strophe, go, your hour has no sisters, you are at home. Imagine what it means for a Jew living in exile in Paris, coming originally from a place called Chernovitz that is no longer as it was, and arriving in Israel, reading this poem, not as the last poem actually of the evening, but stating you are at home. And I would ask you to just keep in mind this du bist zu Hause, this repetition of the final lines with the first underlining of the verb to be, you are. It's not only that you are at home, but you exist. And you are at home. And you can imagine what hopes were connected to this journey that Celan took to Israel in this year. I would also like to remind you, if you don't know, that in April 1970, Celan took his life. That is why next year we are celebrating 50 years from his death and 100 years from his birth. He was born in Chernovitz in 1920. So this is the first thing that I would like you to notice. Du bist zu Hause. The next thing, apart from the trace, which is also something that I will talk about again and again during this evening, is the imperative. Lies nicht mehr, schau nicht mehr, geh. Read no more, look no more, go. So I read this as a demand, but also as an invitation to take these poems and go to the places with these poems and to move with these poems. So to understand the poems as spatial, as being themselves a space in which we can move, but also they invite us to a movement, to an initiative, to a change maybe of status also, from the reading to the seeing, to acknowledging the existence of something, and from the seeing to the walking, okay, to the moving in space. So we are following, while going, a trace, eine Spur, but what is a Spur actually? What is a trace? A trace is something that indicates the absence of something, not its presence, right? We are always connected to something that is no more, actually. So this is the question that drives us when we read these poems. What kind of traces are we following? What are the poems a trace of? So the poems themselves, of course, are a trace of a very specific experience in time and in space, which in this case is, in the case of our topic this evening, is Celan's visit to Jerusalem. But it is in general, of course, the experience of a single person. And how do we relate to the experience of this single person from the distance of space and of time in which we found ourselves, still find ourselves. So here you have an image of Celan reading in October 9th in the evening in Beit Agron. And what I like about this picture particularly is that the page seems white. So you don't see actually the trace of the writing that must have been on it because he was reading, right? But the effect of this paper moving shows us no signs, no trace of the writing, but only a blank page, a white page. And this whiteness will return, as I said. I'm trying to, let's say, prepare the ground for a walk together, which is coming. But this white page, as I said, will return, and it is as if the trace of the letters on the paper had dissolved in a way through the reading, right? Through the loud reading of Celan, somehow the letters on the paper have disappeared again. And this is the only picture I found of Celan in Jerusalem. So here we begin. As I said, Celan wrote a whole series of poems when he came back from Israel. So it was a very fruitful writing time, but those were very personal, very intimate poems. And I will start with this one that I like particularly. I will read it in German and then in English. Einen Stiefel voll Hirn in den Regen gestellt. Es wird ein Gehnsein, ein großes, weit über die Grenzen, die sie uns ziehen. A boot full of brains set out in the rain. There will be a going, a great one, far across the borders they draw for us. So, if you notice, the poem was written on November 9th, 1969. Which of course was not any date, which of course is not any date, but is the day, November 9th, of the Kristallnacht. Of the big pogroms taking place all over Germany. And only 31 years had passed since then, since 1938, right? So the date is surely of a certain importance, but what I would like to point out to you is the second strophe. Es wird ein Gehnsein, ein großes, weit über die Grenzen, die sie uns ziehen. Now, with the imperative that we just had, lies nicht mehr schau, schau nicht mehr geh, we had an imperative, a presence, right? And we had the present tense also in du bist zu Hause. What happens if we have a present tense in a poem? The present tense makes the poem, makes the utterance, the statement, the act of speech present always, right? So every time we reread the poem, this act of speech is actual. I'm saying du bist zu Hause, right? That refers directly to the present. And every poem has this Anspruch, this intention that goes on with it, to be actual every time. And in this case, it is interesting that he here is using the future. Es wird ein Gehnsein. Ein großes, weit über die Grenzen, die sie uns ziehen. he is somehow in this poem referring to a future that is not yet there, but is our future from the point of view of the time in which it was written. And I do think that it is strikingly actual, and it will remain strikingly actual, I fear, that borders are crossed, are being crossed, even though they are still drawn constantly, right? So this is a poem that I think remains very, very actual. And here you see the title of my talk, Ein Gehnsein, right? It is almost impossible to translate this into English. There will be a going, a great one. But please take a look at gehen. So gehen in German, those of you who are familiar with German, usually we write it simply like this, right? So here, Celan is compressing the verb, making it shorter, and gehen. That is how we pronounce it also. And he nominalizes it. Okay, so what German can do, of course, is to make an abstract out of almost any word. So from the verb to go, he is making an abstract out of it. It will be a going. Right? So ein Gehnsein. This is what I wanted to add from the background of the theoretical reflections that Celan has been doing in the 10 years that precede his visit to Israel. And these are two reflections, the second one is coming in a second, that he did while he was writing his Meridianrede, the speech that he held in Darmstadt when he received one of the most prestigious prizes in the German literary scene, the Büchner Prize. And here you see that he's saying, in the poem, everything enters into an occurrence that is co-determined by that which is entering. And the poem that we just read shows that very clearly, because es wird ein Gehnsein weit über die Grenzen, die sie uns ziehen, far beyond the borders that they're drawing on us, or for us. It is something that we can still relate to, I think, right? Borders are being crossed every day and are being crossed every day. And so this is, I think, something that is fundamental to Celan's poetry and that I thought was important to share with you. The importance of the relationship of that which we bring into the reading when we read these poems, our time, our experience of today, to which the poems still talk to and want to talk to and for. And this is what I was already hinting at. Das Gedicht ist nie aktuell, sondern aktualisierbar. The poem is never actual. It can only be made actual. And here you have the reference. Those are notes. So he didn't say these things explicitly at this lecture, at this event that he was talking at. But here you see a very clear statement of what he thinks that poetry can and should do, right? Poem is never actual itself. It is not. It doesn't belong to actuality as a newspaper article, for example. But it can be made. Es ist aktualisierbar, and those that are asked to make it actual are of course the readers. It's us reading the poems. You remember the Gehnsein from the poem that I just read to you? So this is a comment by Ilana Shmueli, who was the person who accompanied Celan, as I just said before, on this walk through the city. It was a very close friend, maybe more, probably more than just a friend. But she knew the city well, and she walked with him. And most of the poems or all of the poems that Celan wrote after he came back to Paris, he sent to her. She was the addressee of these poems. So these poems are actually born out of what could be described as a dialogue or as an act of love also. So she was the one who was receiving these poems, and she wrote long after Celan's death. So it was published in 2000, a small little book of memoirs where she describes this time with Celan, her relationship with Celan, and she also comments on many of the poems that she received. And one of the comments is this, and it refers directly to the poem that we just read. I read it only in English. "History has devoured geography," he said once. "Borders are being drawn, they mark enmities. So his brain embarks on a great being as going, way beyond the borders that are drawn for us. Here he invents for us the word Gehnsein, an act and a form of being that moves further and further in the open. Ein Tun und ein Sein, das sich immer weiter ins Offene begibt." So here again you have an abstract substantive, something that German can do so well and many other languages can't. So in the open, let's say das Offene, it's something that will come back later on in another poem. There she's referring to another poem from this series. But as you can see, the title of my talk actually is an invention of Ilana Shmueli, not of Celan. Because if you remember, the poem said, "Es wird ein Gehnsein." Those are two different words, right? The sein is still a verb. And she makes a substantive out of it, right? And she also leads the whole question into a very explicitly political Angelegenheit, right? And something that is an issue, a political issue of drawing border and crossing borders. And I remind you that exactly 2 years before in Israel, a border was taken down, places were accessible, but at the same time, in the same places now, borders are being built, right? So in many places where Celan and Ilana Shmueli went to, there is now a wall. So this is an interesting development. I did a project with a friend, the sound walk. We went to the places physically, and they changed a lot. And one of the changes, the most dramatic changes, is around the tomb of Rachel, where they also went, in Bethlehem. And Kever Rachel, the tomb of Rachel, is now on all sides, it has a wall around it on all sides, 10 meters high wall. So it is interesting in this sense how the Gehnsein relates to the places. Okay, so this is a quotation from the Meridian, the speech that I was talking to you about just a second ago. And here he says, "My ladies and gentlemen, I find something that somewhat consoles me of having walked in your presence this impossible road, this road of the impossible. I find something that binds and that, as the poem does, leads to an encounter." So here you see this is, I remind you, 1960, so 9 years have passed since then. In this context, he is talking about maps of childhood. He's trying to draw a map of his childhood. He's saying in his speech, "I try to find the places of my childhood, and they are no longer there," right? And Eastern Europe changed completely after the war, as we know. So he is trying to walk back, and he's saying that it is a road of the impossible, the one that leads us back into the past. It is an impossible road, and yet he also says that he has walked it, right? So in a way, these two contradictions seem to be possible in the poem. And also in a moment where we address someone and the addressee seems to be attentive, and in German you say empfänglich, someone who is able to accept and to take in what the person who is speaking is saying. So it is an encounter, a relationship between two people coming from different histories and walking a road together with the willingness to walk this road together. And here we have a statement from a letter. So we jump again in time. We are back in 1969. Celan has come back from Israel. It's 4 days after he came back. By the way, he came back earlier than planned. So he was supposed to stay longer than October 17th, but he decided to come back to Paris. He said that he didn't deserve to visit Masada. I will come back to that at the end. Why? It is unclear. We don't know why he said he didn't deserve it, but it certainly had something to do with what he, as a Jew from the diaspora living in France, could contribute to a place like Israel, such as Israel was and in the 60s. And to this I will come back at the end. So why did he leave so early or earlier? And so he asks himself when he comes back, how will it look what I write down now after Jerusalem, which is that which we are reading now, right? Well, how will it look what I write down now after Jerusalem? He still doesn't know what he will write while we are reading it already. That Jerusalem would be a turning point, a caesura in my life that I knew. This is the quote that Jan presented at the very beginning of this evening. Dass Jerusalem eine Wende, eine Zäsur sein würde in meinem Leben, das wusste ich. And I would like to pause for a second and think about what a turning point is. What is a Wende? What is a Wende and what is a Caesura, and why is he using these terms? So a turning point, a Wende, eine Umkehr, is a concept that also was already present in the Meridian, in this very important speech that I can only suggest to read because it is a very intensive, a very interesting read. So he's referring here to character from a short story by Georg Büchner. Georg Büchner is the famous, considered realist writer of the 19th century in Germany, and to him the prize of the German Academy for Language and Poetry is dedicated to his name, Georg Büchner Prize, and so mostly all the people that receive this prize try to engage on some level with the work of Georg Büchner. And in this case, Celan is referring to the character Lenz. Now Lenz is a historical character, a writer in his own right. From the time of the Sturm und Drang, a contemporary of Goethe. So Celan here is quoting from the short story that Büchner wrote about Lenz, and he quotes this very short line: only sometimes the fact that he could not walk on his head made him uncomfortable. Okay, so Lenz is going to a crisis, a personal crisis, an artistic crisis, and this is the comment that Celan takes out. And he says, he adds to that, someone who walks on his head, my ladies and gentlemen, someone who walks on his head has the sky as an abyss under him. Right? So here again we have the walking. But it is an impossible walking because you cannot really walk on your head, right? You can walk on your hands maybe, but you cannot walk on your head. And so it makes him uncomfortable that he cannot do that, and this is a very famous line from Celan. Someone who walks on his head is someone with an abyss, the sky is an abyss under him. Now, this can be interpreted in various ways. What I'm interested in is only this movement of turning, right? Of turning on your head, of putting everything upside down. And this is a key understanding of how Celan sees the poem and the language that the poem represents. So the language that is concentrated in a poem is the language that puts language itself on its head. So when every time we read a poem, or hopefully every poem that we read should enable us to understand language in a radically, completely new way, and to embody and to be able to speak a language that is new, that is not the language of borders between people, for example, of misunderstandings, which is our usual language, or a language of cliches, of commonplaces that we speak without really thinking about it, without really being conscious of what we are saying. So what he's saying, Lenz is an image of poetry in the Meridian, and poetry can be many things. Among these things, it is the moment where we turn things upside down, and suddenly when we turn things upside down, we have the sky as an abyss under our feet. So as you can see, Wende, Umkehr, turning point, is an important concept in Celan's, let's say, imagery and in his poetic fantasy, let's call it. And so if we read, if he says to Ilana Shmueli, it was a Wende, a turning point, we know that it is also this. It is something that, a journey that put everything upside down. And the question is how? The other concept is more complex, Zäsur. So in German it doesn't sound as precious, let's say, as the word sounds in English, because in English we have to recur to a Latin word, right? So it sounds a little bit more precious, a bit more exotic. Zäsur in German doesn't have the same quality. It still is a quite special, maybe technical word, but it's less estranging, let's say. So Zäsur means very concretely, for example, the cutting of a tree. So when a trunk is cut, we have a Zäsura, we have a cut. Okay, so it's simply a cut. But it came down into the history of into metrics, into the theory of poetics and of poetry writing as a very technical term. And the technical term means a division into a verse, a pause inside a verse, right? So every verse is usually divided into feet, for example, in English, and it needs a pause somehow. We need to catch our breath when we read, right? So the technical term is Zäsura. And this is something that Celan wrote himself, again among the notes for the Meridian speech. He says, in the kola, the meaning is often joined and united in a truer way than in rhyme. Figure of the poem, that is the presence of the single breathing individual. So kolen, what I call here kola, is not there is not the same terminology in English, of course, because each poetic tradition has its own terminology. But the kolen are the two parts of the verse that are divided by this pause. Okay, so when he's saying the pause is the moment where we feel the presence of another person, because in the moment that we hear a breathing, that is the presence of a person, not when he's talking, but the pause, the absence, the trace, right? The trace is what we are looking for when we are reading a poem. And what he's saying is the presence of the individual is not so much in what the individual says, but in the things that he or she doesn't say, in the things that are missing, in the pause between one thing and the next, in the way we read maybe also. Okay, so now we have our concepts ready. We have Ein Gehnsein, this idea of walking through a landscape that is the landscape of the poems themselves. We have the idea of a trace. We have the borders, but which borders? Borders, of course, between countries, between people, but also the border of the white page, right? And the border between writing and reading, the border between reading and listening, the border between reading and acting. And we have our cut. Okay, so if this term seems a little bit too obsolete, too estranging for you, you can just think of a cut, okay, of a pause, which is in itself a trace. So here we have another poem from the Jerusalem series, from November 29, 1969. You remember we had the one from November 9th. Now we are almost a month later. I read it both in German and in English. Ich trink Wein aus 2 Gläsern und zerkere an der Königszäsur wie jener am Pindar. Gott gibt die Stimmgabel ab, als einer der kleinen Gerechten, aus der Lostrommel fällt unser Deut. I drink wine from 2 glasses and scamp at the king's caesura like that other does with Pindar. God turns in the turning fork of one of the small just ones, from the lottery drum falls our Deut. So I don't want to interpret, just to give you a bit of the sound of what is going on in this cycle. I just wanted to let you know, to show you that this term caesura comes back in the poems themselves. So usually when Celan writes letters or poetological texts, texts on poetry, which are not many, these concepts come back in the poems, right? There is not such a divisive border between the different parts of the writing and of the letters and the poetry. So the terms wander from one text to the next. So here you have in Caradonna, the Königszäsur, you hear the cut, right? You hear the sound of the cutting through this sound. And here he's referring to another poem, actually, because the one who is cutting, who's camping, who's working not comme il faut at King's Caesura is Hölderlin. So Hölderlin, Friedrich Hölderlin, very important reference point, reference person for Celan, especially in these later years. But the question is, what is the king's caesura, the Königszäsur? And the figure of the king, of course, is an important figure if we think of Jerusalem, right? Jerusalem founded by King David. And King David will come back in another poem, indirectly, not explicitly, but so when we think of Jerusalem, we think of kings. It is the seat of the kings, right? So you will come, this idea will come back in another poem. This is Ilana Shmueli, finally, and I just wanted to bring you this quote because she is the one to whom we owe the knowledge that we have of this walk that Celan took. Okay, because as you can see here, she said, we went together through Jerusalem. He then asked me to write down all the roads we had walked, to list them in order for him to be able to follow back their traces, the Spuren. And I wrote it down for him somewhat quickly and insufficiently. So here again, you have the same terminology, right? You have the walking, the remembrance, the effort to remember, and the question of the trace. And so Ilana Shmueli listed very carefully all the places that they visited, and along these lines, we also walk through Jerusalem with the poem. Here you have a map of Jerusalem. Those of you who have been won't be very surprised by this map. It is a map from 1969. This is why I brought this one here and not any other map. It's also a map that I like from the design. I'm still looking for the heirs because you can see there it's a screenshot from the National Library, so it's not. It's a pirate version of the map. But here you can see Bet HaKerem. This was the place where Celan was staying in Jerusalem. Here in pink you see the old city, right, with the Wailing Wall, Kotel, with the Dome of the Rock, which Celan also visited. And then he wanted to go away very quickly from the Wailing Wall and the Dome of the Rock. He said, there is too much holiness here. I want to leave. And now you'll see here is the Knesset, the parliament. And I have enlarged vision to show you exactly how they walked. So there you see Mount Scopus, right? It's over there. And then we have Mount of Olives. So they walked all this way on the ridge of the two mountains. So from Mount Scopus to Mount of Olives. They walked past the Chapel of the Ascension, which is here. Then they walked down. Here is Gethsemane, the Mount of Olives of Jesus last night before his arrest. Here you have the tomb of Absalom, to which I will come later. And here we have Mount Zion and David's grave. Okay, so you have here Absalom's grave, who was the son of David, and here you have David's grave. And they are, for those of you who have not been in Jerusalem, they are on different levels. So David's grave is on Mount Zion, so in a height, and Absalom's grave is down in the Kidron Valley. Okay, so this is to give you an idea of the geography of the walk. So you have to imagine that from here, and I'll show you pictures in a minute, you have a panoramic view over the city. It's maybe the most spectacular view that you can have of Jerusalem from there. Okay, so we start at Mount Scopus. Here you see what was the National Library. At that point, Mount Scopus had become accessible for the Jewish population since 2 years. I mean, it was an outpost of the Israeli army, but it was in Jordanian territory. And so from 1948 until 1967, the university, which was founded in 1918, and the campus some years later. So it was had been inaccessible. Okay, so we had the buildings, the original buildings, but from 48 till 76, nothing much had happened there. And this is one of the earliest, or maybe the earliest even building of the campus, which today hosts the humanities. Okay, today, of course, it has been expanded very much, but most of the buildings of the campus today have been built from the 70s onwards. So Celan actually saw it in the status in which it was almost in 48. So here you see it, and this is. So these are the comments from Shmueli herself. The amphitheater on Mount Scopus, the view towards the Dead Sea in the mist. Okay, so you have here the amphitheater and the desert, the Judean desert, stretching out, and then in the back you have the Dead Sea. Okay, and this amphitheater is actually not only an important place because the inauguration event of the university when it was founded was held there also, but it still looks like this today. Okay, so today when students finish their masters or their doctorates, the festivities take place here, and the diplomas are given out exactly on this place, and it looks almost the same. This is a view from the amphitheater, and you see the desert, and this road was not there, and there you see this is a Palestinian village, and after that there is Male Adumim. Okay, so what is called a settlement or a Jewish enclave in the West Bank. Okay, so then the walk goes on from Mount Scopus along the ridge of the mountain, and so she rides along the hill past the chapel of the Ascension, then the view of the city. The domes of the mosques dominate the scene. Okay, so here you have the dome of the rock, Al-Aqsa. This is already Mount Zion in the back, and the whole of the old city stretching out in front of the viewer. And on the other side there is then the Jewish cemetery. This is a picture that is now not so clear, of course, because of the colors. I'm sorry. But here you can see the graves of the Jewish cemetery, and actually what is even clearer now with this picture is the dome. Okay, in the black and white picture, of course, you could not see it, but the most striking thing that we all know of images from Jerusalem is this golden dome, right? I'm sure that you have seen it also in pictures if you have not been in Jerusalem. This golden dome is a trademark of the city, a very known one. And so we see that it wanders into the poem, right? How does it get into a poem from November 7th, 1969? Okay, so 2 days earlier than the first poem that we saw. Das Leuchten, ja jenes, das Abutor auf uns zureiten sah, als wir ineinander verwaisten vor Leben, nicht nur von den Handwurzeln her. Eine Goldboje aus Tempeltiefen maß die Gefahr aus, die uns still unterlag. The radiance, yes, the one that Abutor saw riding towards us, when we orphaned into each other out of life, not only up from the hand's roots. A gold boy from temple depths measured the danger that silently underlay us. So, what I would like to concentrate on is the second stanza. Eine Goldboje aus Tempeltiefen maß die Gefahr aus, die uns still unterlag. Once you have been in Jerusalem and you have done this walk, you see Goldboje, that is the first association actually that you have. You see physically the dome of the rock in front of your eyes, and here you see also from which perspective. So it's another perspective than the one that I showed you, because they were coming back from Bethlehem towards the city, and they crossed Abu Toa, which is a neighborhood, a mixed Arab and Jewish neighborhood to the south of the old city. And so they were coming back from Bethlehem, and also from there you have a majestic view of the old city, and this dome that Celan understands as a boy, right? A boy is this sign in the water that helps people on sea orient themselves on sea, in the water, and also gives a sign of something that is there or should not be crossed, or it's a point of reference, right? So he makes a boy out of it, which makes Jerusalem some kind of sea. And it's a very interesting reflection to make. Aus Tempeltiefen, a gold boy from temple depths. Now, this is the inside of the Dome of the Rock. It's a very old picture of 1915. As many of you probably know, the Dome of the Rock is not accessible anymore to non-Muslims. So it's not possible to access this point that is the holiest maybe point. The holiest maybe point in the city. This is the rock of the Dome of the Rock. And it is said that the world was created from there. Okay, so this is a place with a lot of meaning and carries a lot of weight. Not only the world was created from there, but also, of course, it was the center of the temple, of the temple that Solomon built, of the first and the second temple, and of any future temple. And it is holy to Muslims as well, of course, because from there Muhammad ascended to heavens to have his prayer with all what I love to call the VIPs of monotheistic religions. So he gathered there in prayer with all the prophets. It is one of the holiest places maybe in the world, at least for the monotheistic religions. And a friend of mine who is an expert in Talmud, Yakir Paz, he told me a very nice, wonderful story that seems to be at the back of this stanza. And he was telling me that there is a midrash according to which David wanted to build a temple, right? He founded the city, which now is also called the city of David, and wanted to start to build a temple there. But when he started to take out the earth in order to make space for the temple, water started coming up, right? And it was the menace of a second diluvio universale. How do you say in English? I don't remember. Flood, exactly. Thank you. It was the beginning of a second flood, right? So it was a problem. Apparently, David was not the one who had been chosen to build the temple. So at that point, the question was, how do we control the water that is coming out incessantly from this very center of the world, the navel of the world? And so the Midrash apparently says that David started singing. Now David is the poet, of course, the author of the Psalms. So he started singing his wonderful music and song, and so the water started receding. And fortunately, the world was not destroyed the second time over. So it seems to me, at least when I was reading this poem with this friend of mine who is so knowledgeable in these traditional texts, it really resounded with this strophe. Eine Goldboje aus Tempeltiefen maß die Gefahr aus, die uns still unterlag. So the story, the walk goes on from the view of the old city that we just had, from this idea of the dome of the rock being more of a buoy that in which we orient ourselves in a moment of danger, but to which also we keep a certain distance, right? We don't get too close. We see it from afar, and from afar we can consider it as a kind of point of reference in our wanderings. By the way, also think about the fact that the buoy has to be anchored to something, right? To a very, very heavy rock. And I think you just saw the rock that holds this buoy, that is the dome of the temple, of the dome of the rock. So Ilana Shmueli goes on and says the long walk through the old Jerusalem, durch Alt Jerusalem, on a burning day of Chamsin. We chose Absalom's grave, not the Gethsemane garden. We did not want this cup to pass by us, and we did not want to know who is overwhelmed now by that pain of that one over there. Now, this is a very interesting passage. First, you see the word Chamsin. I'm sure that those who have been in Israel know what Chamsin is. It is the hottest wind that comes from the desert. So they were there in October, and it was still very, very hot. This is also why you have all this terminology linked to heat in these poems. You see virtually the light and the heat come through the poems and being held somehow in the poems. Celan writes then when he's back, I'm back in rainy Paris. It's so cold, right? It is October. And it's also the quality of the city, of course, that gives this, because if you know Jerusalem, you know that it's all built in this white stone, right? Even Yerushalmi, the white stone of Jerusalem. So this stone absorbs and reflects even more light than there would in any case be. So it's a hot day, a burning day of Chamsin, and glühenden Chamsin-Tag. And what you imagine those two wanderers, those two flaneurs, walking through the city, through this part of the city, and passing by the Mount of Olives, passing by the Gethsemane garden, deciding consciously not to enter the Garden of Olives, where Jesus spent his last night praying before he was betrayed by Judas and then captured and brought finally to his death. Okay, so they decide to pass by, and how does Ilana explain that? She says, we did not want this cup to pass by us, and we did not want to know who is overwhelmed now by that pain of that one over there. Of course, that one over there is Jesus, and we didn't want this cup to pass by us. Now, this is a reference to this very, very famous part in the section in the Gospels. It's also in Matthew and Lucas, but Mark's version is the most, I think, strong and explicit. And it says, this is the King James version, Abba, Father, all things are possible unto thee. Take away this cup from me. Nevertheless, not what I will, but what thou wilt. Now, this is a very famous scene in the Gospels. Why? Because it's the only place where Jesus doubts, where he says, I don't want this. I don't want to do this. Leave me in peace. I don't want to die. Take away this cup from me. Then there is a pause, and apparently God tells to his son something, and he says, okay, not what I will, but what thou wilt. And then the story goes on, as we know. It's also note, all things are possible unto thee, right? And the reflection on the impossibility, we have here an instance that is God, to whom everything is possible. This is the comment that Ilana has on their decision not to go into the Gethsemane garden, but rather to choose the story of another son, which is the story of Absalom, which is told in the second book of Samuel. It is an incredibly interesting and very complex story of the relationship between a son and a father, between two generations. The question of power is discussed. the question of rebellion. Absalom wants to take his father's place in a way, but he is also an instance that criticizes David's passivity at this point. So David is already king, and he has trouble intervening. He has trouble taking his responsibility as king when it's necessary, when crimes are committed, such as the rape of Absalom's sister Tamar by her brother Amnon. So Absalom kills his brother, and this sets into motion a whole chain of events that will lead at the end to Absalom's own very dramatic death, actually in this very region. So unfortunately here you don't see the image so well, but this is the Garden of Gethsemane seen from the other side of the Kidron Valley. And the death of Absalom will be a very, very cruel one. He has beautiful hair. He is riding a donkey. He rides this donkey and his hair remains captured in a tree. At that point, he is stabbed to death by the forces, by the soldiers of David. David had asked his soldiers to deal kindly with his rebellious son, and when he dies, he cries out with pain. So it's a very dramatic story. Here you see a modern version. This was taken in September 2009, and it's exactly the same. This is a part of the city that has almost not changed, as you can see. There are only more graves. Okay, so here you see the poem, which I think, to me, is the most telling. There are two of the most powerful and telling poems of this Jerusalem cycle. Die Glut, and here you have the heat, right? Pierre Joris decided to translate the swelter. So swelter is this extreme heat. I changed the translation a little bit in order to make it a little bit more literal. Die Glut zählt uns zusammen im Eselschrei vor Absaloms Grab, auch hier. Gethsemane drüben, das Umgangene, wen überhäuft's? Am nächsten der Tore tut sich nichts auf. Über dich, offene, trag ich dich zu mir. The swelter adds us together, adds us, with you of course, adds us together in the ass's bray before Absalom's tomb. Here, Gethsemane over there, bypassed, whom does it overwhelm? At the nearest gate, nothing happens. Through you, open one, I carry you toward me. So I would like to start with the second strophe, Gethsemane over there, bypassed, whom does it overwhelm? Gethsemane drüben, das Umgangene, wen überhäuft's? And if you notice the difference, there is one fundamental and very radical difference between what Ilana Shmueli is reporting in her memories and what Celan is doing here in the poem, because whereas Shmueli's report is an affirmation, is a statement, right? We didn't want that the cup passed by us. We didn't want to know what the pilgrims there, the Christian pilgrims, were experiencing while trying to relive Jesus' last moments in loneliness and doubt in the garden. So it's a statement, it's a strong affirmation of distancing. Whereas Celan is asking a question, right? Gethsemane over there, bypassed, whom does it overwhelm? Does it overwhelm anybody? Is there really somebody that relates to this very, very tragic moment and very profound moment that this single individual that is Jesus in that moment of the story is experiencing, right? So there is a slight change and a movement from the affirmation to the question that I think is very significant. And here you see actually another interesting turn, right? It was talking about turns at the beginning, and here you have another interesting turn, because actually when you walk, the Gethsemane is the first place that you encounter, and then you find Kever Avshalom, the tomb of Absalom. But here it's the contrary, right? You first pass by the grave of Absalom, and then you get to the Gethsemane. Because this is the view that I showed you before, this is the view from the other side of the Kidron Valley. Okay, you have Gethsemane drüben on the other side, right? And here you have also, again, this open. You remember that Celan walks, according to Ilana Shmueli, that his Gehnsein, his going as being, leads us always into an openness, right? In a place without borders, in a place where things change and can be turned upside down. So here now I wanted to take you to Absalom's grave. This is an image that I took also a couple of months ago. Here you see Absalom's grave. And it's actually very characteristic monument. It's of a Hellenistic time, so it's, let's say, a legend that it would be Absalom's grave. At the end of the Absalom episode, we learn that Absalom had built a monument to himself before his death because he was childless. And so this is a much later historically monument, but here is the Gethsemane, so you walk down and here you see already the walls of the city, right? And here is the monument itself. This is a historical picture, and this is the road that you take that leads you to the grave. Now, Ilana again comments and says, we chose Absalom, the rebellious and yet beloved son, Absalom, the contradictory, abyssal, lonely one who made himself a monument while still alive, Absalom with his beautiful sister Tamar, the one who was raped by her half-brother, Absalom to whom the people cried, long live the king, twice before he went into his terrible death. We stood in front of the stone in the midday heat, we were alone, no sound, only the donkey's bray. Okay, so again, one thing that is interesting here is that actually Ilana is misquoting the biblical story, because the long live the king is not spoken by the people, but it's spoken by Hushai, who is the counselor of David, who will give a bad counsel to Absalom. So Hushai will be sent from David to his son to give him the counsel of a strategical military council. At that point, David is outside of the city and Absalom is inside, is approaching the city, and they're about to clash with each other. And so Hushai goes to Absalom and he has to convince him that he's trustworthy. And in order to convince him that he's trustworthy, he says, long live the king. Because Absalom says to him, why? I don't trust you. You are David's friend, why are you coming to me to give me counsel? And so he repeats 2 times, long live the king. Long live the king is a very important statement in the world, let's say the poetical and philosophical world of Paul Celan. And here I'm bringing you back to the Meridian speech, to the speech that he gave in 1960, because in order to understand the net that he is, the roads, you remember the first image on the back of the title of my talk, there is a net of references that is opened up by each word that is in these letters and in these poems. And this is one of the central passages of this speech that Celan gave. And it refers to another text by Georg Büchner, the already mentioned Georg Büchner. So Büchner had not only wrote this short story Lenz that I already mentioned, but also a theater piece called Danton's Tod. Danton's Tod deals with the French Revolution. It's a wonderful theater piece on the French Revolution. And one of the characters is Lucille. Lucille is the wife of Camille. Camille is one of the members of the revolution, let's say, who is then in the bloody part of the revolution led to the guillotine. Okay, so she is mourning already her dead husband. And Celan says, there is Lucille who is art blind, the same Lucille for whom language has a person-like, perceivable character. She's back with her sudden long live the king. It is the counter word, it is the word that cuts off the thread, the word that does not bow in front of the guards and parade horses of history. It is an act of freedom, it is a step. Okay, this is a very dense passage. I won't explain everything, but I want to say that, to explain to you a little bit the scene in which this is happening. So Lucille is the wife of a member of the political elite of the French Revolution. He is led to his death. She's mourning him, and she is at loss of words. She doesn't know what to do. She doesn't know how to express her grief. Her words fail her, and she doesn't know how to act. And so she does something that is absurd. Guards are approaching, so revolutionary guards are approaching, and she says, "Long live the king." Now, it's obvious what will happen, right? She's arrested, and in her turn led certainly to the guillotine. Now, the theater piece doesn't show us that. This is the last scene. Okay, after these words, she is captured, and she's taken to what we know is her death. Now, it's not that she really believes in what she's saying. It's not that she believes in the statement, "Long live the king." She's not a monarchic, okay? She's not someone who wants the king to come back. But she knows that that she can appropriate this statement as a sign of resistance and of opposition in this context. Okay, so it's not so much about the meaning of the words, but it's about what the words do in the context in which they are embedded. And the context in which they are embedded is a context in which this statement has the meaning of a revolutionary act, when the revolution itself has become a counter-revolution in a way, right? In this very bloody part of the revolution. So this is why Celan calls it a counter-word. Okay, it's a word that goes against those who exert violence and oppression. And it's an act of freedom, the only act of freedom that she has in this context. And it's a step. And then here you see that the movement returns, right? What is happening here is what Celan is saying is a statement, a word can be a step. Right? We're not only moving with our bodies, but we are moving with the language that we speak. And we speak a language that is a step towards the direction of something new and of something different if we turn language upside down. Because what she's doing is taking the statements and turning it upside down, right? It's not the common "Long live the king," it's another "Long live the king." It's not the "Long live the king" that we understand when we hear it. So remember that Shmueli here is quoting this. And this, as you remember, if you remember, is another "Long live the king." It's a treacherous "Long live the king." Hushai's "Long live the king" is also not really meant, right? Because he doesn't consider Absalom to be the king. He considers David to be the king. But he uses these words in order to manipulate Absalom into believing in him. Okay, so you have here exactly the same words in a completely different context and with a completely different meaning, and also with a completely different end. And of course, this resounded in the back of what Celan was experiencing and what we are experiencing when we read these poems and go through Jerusalem. Here, unfortunately, you don't see it almost. You see the name. The Golden Gate, Shara Rachamim, is here in the darkness. This is a poem. This is a picture that I took, and I see that I'm already much over time. So I concentrate briefly on Shara Rachamim because it's a very important place, and I'm already almost at the end. So if you bear with me for another minute. Shara Rachamim is a very special place in Jerusalem, as the Jerusalemites amongst you will know. It's the only gate in Jerusalem that leads in the walls of the old city that leads directly on the Temple Mount. Now the Temple Mount is called in Hebrew Har HaBayit, okay, the mount of the home, of the house. Remember the Zuhause, right? You are at home. So this is the gate that leads directly to the Temple Mount, but the gate is closed. It is sealed. Now, the history goes that the story goes, not the history, the story goes that the gates will open when the Messiahs will come. Okay, the Messiah will get to the Temple Mount through this gate from the other side of the Kidron Valley where we were, on the side of the Mount of Olives. Okay, he will come and get here, and then it will open up. And remember the question of close and open that we had already, right? Often, trage ich dich zu mir, I bring you to myself through the gates. So Keva Avshalom is here, let's say, in the valley, and then you go up and you reach Shara Rachamim, which is also called, so Rachamim is piety in Hebrew, right? So we pray for piety, for the piety of God at this gate. Now, this gate was closed in historical times. It was not always closed. And here we have one of the maybe most symbolic poems that Celan wrote, after his Jerusalem visit, maybe the most significant and maybe the most complex even. So in November 21st, he writes the poem. Die Pole sind in uns, unübersteigbar, im Wachen, wir schlafen hinüber vors Tor des Erbarmens. Ich verliere dich an dich, das ist mein Schneetrost. Sag, dass Jerusalem ist. Sag, als wäre ich dieses, dein Weiß, als wärst du meins, als könnten wir ohne uns wir sein. Ich blättere dich auf für immer, du betest, du bettest uns frei. The poles are in us, insurmountable. While awake, we sleep across to the gate of mercy. I lose you to you, that is my snow comfort. Say that Jerusalem is. Say it as if I was this, your whiteness, as if you were mine, as if without us we could be we. I leave you open forever, you pray, you lay us free. Okay, so you see, I think the complexity of the poem is quite evident. I would like to begin with the title before we move on in the poem. This is again a quote from the Meridian, written in 1960. It is the continuation of the quote that I already brought to you before. So we read together, my ladies and gentlemen, I find something that somewhat consoles me of having walked in your presence this impossible road, this road of the impossible. You remember we were talking about if it is possible to go the same way twice, to go into the same water twice. This road of the impossible, I find something that binds, and that, as the poem does, leads to an encounter. And the continuation of this is, I find something. Okay, so I can walk this road of the impossible, and I find something that is, as language, immaterial but earthly, terrestrial, something circular, returning back to itself through both poles, and by way of that, cheerfully, heitererweise, even crossing the tropes, I find a meridian. Okay, this is the title of the speech that Celan gave. Also, maybe one of the most famous images from his poetic world. Here you have to really think of the geographical meridian, right? You have the two poles, and then the meridian binding the two poles and going around the earth. And this is what represents for Celan what poetry is also about a connection that is very earthly and very concrete. And so here we have these poles, right, the very beginning, the two poles that are connected by the meridian, but are two opposites in a way, right? They are 2 points that cannot touch each other, never touch each other. And these 2 points are very simply also you and I, right? Each person in a dialogue with another person, a reader and a writer, for example. So the poles are in us, they are also in us. Okay, this dialogue takes place in us as well. And we sleep, so they are insurmountable while awake. Okay, so I would, for example, take out the second comma after insurmountable, because it's not there in the German, and in the German it's very clear. While we are awake, these poles are not surmountable. We cannot join them. But maybe when we are asleep, it is possible, right? And we are sleeping our way towards the gate of mercy, which I just saw. Showed you the closed gate, actually. And here you have this very famous statement: "Sagt, dass Jerusalem ist." Say that Jerusalem is. As if Jerusalem was only ever the result of a speech act, right? And the Hebrew translation of Shmueli, who translated all these poems, is very beautiful, and gives an underlining. Sagt, dass Jerusalem ist. Okay, you have to say it for it to be true. And the continuation of the poem, with the reference to the white, say as if it was, I was this your whiteness, as if you were mine, and I leave you open forever, is a reference to the process of writing already, right? We have a translation from the walking and from the walking together into a space that is a space of writing rather than a space of going. So here you see again modern, the colors are not so clear, but the modern and an old version of Shafir, which is still closed. Now, I thought a lot about this Sagt, dass Jerusalem ist. Right? It is somehow a mysterious verse. Of course we can understand it by saying you need to say it in order for it to exist. Right? But recently, and this is a very recent discovery, I was reading this volume, La Conscience Juive, which is a publication, it is a series, and this is the first volume that was published in 1963 of the Conference of Jewish Intellectuals of French tongue. And Celan was reading this when he came back from Jerusalem. And in one of the, it was a conference, so one speaker spoke and then there was a discussion after that. And the philosopher Vladimir Yankelevich, of Russian origin but French acquisition, gave a lecture, and Leon Al-Ghazi, who was participating in this discussion, reported an anecdote. Right? He reported an anecdote of a discussion. It was his so Yankelevich spoke, and the first thing that Leon Al-Ghazi says, I was reminded of a conversation that I had with other Jewish friends, and the discussion started with the question, why am I Jewish? Pourquoi je suis juif? And the mathematician Jacques Hadamard responded, I'm Jewish because anti-Semitism is. Okay? I'm Jewish because anti-Semitism is. And the archaeologist and art historian Salomon Reinach responded, no, my dear friend, we are Jewish because Judaism exists. Okay? So this is a very 20th century discussion. The position of Hadamard could be considered a Sartrean position, right? So Jewish, to be Jewish is dependent on the hate of the anti-Semite, and as soon as the anti-Semite is gone, the Jew will also go.
Sartre was also.
I'm saying, yes, this is a Sartrean position, right? And the answer of Salomon Reinach is a positive answer, right? It's to say, no, we are actually not dependent on the anti-Semites to define ourselves. And so, this is a very interesting
reflection, or very explicit reflection, that is reported in this volume, and I wanted to show you what Yankelevich said. So the interesting thing is that Yankelevich himself was coming from a journey, his first journey to Israel, just like Celan had. Okay, so he says, and you have the French, if you can read it, I read the English, to say the truth, the journey I just made has not brought a solution to this interior problem. On the contrary, it has made it more acute in the sense that it confronts us with urgent options. It has created a state of tension that is greater still than the contradiction that I carry in me. Die Pole sind in uns. The poles are inside us. The contradiction that I carry in me, for the temporal, secular existence of Israel as a state that exists on the surface of the earth, makes the dilemma more acute, the alternative that each of us has in himself more acute. Right? Either to be a Jew in the diaspora, or to be a Jew in Israel. It is not the same, and Vladimir Yankelevich goes on to reflect it in his text, Le Judaïsme problème intérieur, Judaism, an interior problem. And at the end of the talk, he says, this situation of tension between a state as any other, and an immense dispersion that cannot be reabsorbed, which is diaspora, and maintains everywhere and in each place the uncanny principle of spirituality, of unreason, of contradiction, this principle that we embody right here and now in the conference about what it means to be, or what it is to be a French Jew, or to be a Jewish Frenchman, that we embody right here and now is the source of a fruitful debate. They are discussing all the time, right? A whole series of volumes comes out of this. It is uncanny, inquiétant. It is uncanny, even if it does not belong to the order of tragedy anymore, to the tragedy of Absalom, for example. It is an appeal to always search somewhere else, always further and beyond. Okay, so I think this is very explicit in itself on how it could resonate to Celan, and I actually didn't find up to now a description that could be better than this to describe what it must have been like for Celan to... it's not ended, this is the end, actually. So on the back of this reflection by Yankelevich that is very explicit and very eloquent, I would like to present to you the very last poem, written on November 8th, so the day before the first poem that I showed you, which contains exactly the elements that we have been speaking about. So the Gehnsein, the being as being on the go, walking on foot, the borders that we had, the turning, the caesura, all these elements come, and the imperative of the first poem that you might remember, lies nicht mehr schau, schau nicht mehr geh. Du bist zu Hause, du bist zu Hause. Komm, leg die Welt aus mit dir. Komm, lass mich euch zuschütten mit allem meinen. Eins mit dir bin ich, uns zu erbeuten, auch jetzt. Come, explain the world with you. Come, let me fill you all up with all that's mine, all the hearsay. One with you am I, to capture us also now. So two things, mit allem meinen. This in German is not univocal, it has a double meaning, because it could be all that belongs to me, all which is mine. I'm filling you up, I'm covering you, I'm burdening you with all that is mine, which is the poems themselves, actually. I mean, we have been now 1 hour and a half almost being filled up with all that is belonged to one single individual, and I put my part in it, right? Mit allem meinen, but meinen is also to have an opinion, right? Ich meine, I mean, to mean, right? The hearsay, the things that are said in general, that we have the challenge and also the obligation to turn upside down and make our own, in a way. Eins bin ich, eins mit dir bin ich. This is, I think, the expression of a hope. I am one with you. Am I one with you? Auch jetzt. And here at the end you have again the actualization that I started with. Das Gedicht ist nie aktuell, sondern aktualisierbar. The poem is never actual, it can only be made actual. And with this, I encourage you to read more and further, and thank you for your attention.